It's spooky season, so let's get a bit spooky. This is all I had on short notice, but it'll do for now. Yes, I am well aware that it's almost Halloween, and it probably seems like pretty low-hanging fruit to dive into horror tropes and ghouls and spooks and questionable costumes, but I absolutely adore horror and dark fantasy in TTRPGs, and often find myself leaning towards running these kind of games because I like being unsettled and unsettling my players with their approval and knowledge. So, from having run and played in multiple spookier games, I like to think I've pulled together a pretty hefty list of lessons learned and recommendations for running good and effective horror for your players. So, without further ado, one of the most critical aspects of running horror in whatever TTRPG system you're using is identifying the type of horror that you're trying to go for, because you have a lot of options. There's Gothic horror, which is all about the terror within, not without. This theme is used to shatter the illusion of humanity in a poignant way by holding up a mirror to us and saying, look at what we truly are and look at what we pretend to be. And it's unsettling. There's cosmic or Lovecraftian horror, which revolves around the fear of personal insignificance. This genre is predicated on the idea of entities so vast and so genuinely beyond our comprehension that we cannot fathom their simple motivations. There's also body horror, which examines the universal fear of our own failing anatomies. Typically, this genre of horror intentionally showcases grotesque or physiologically disturbing violations of the human body, and it's a lot. It's really a lot, and it's pretty overwhelming, and understandably, some people don't want to go anywhere near this. A good friend of mine, Diana, ran a much more horrifying, reskinned Curse of Strahd campaign with a lot more gore and body horror, and every description of the monsters that we encountered in the Death House freaked me the fuck out in all of the best ways. There's folk horror, which is my personal favorite, which explores fears of isolation, superstition, paranoia, lost truths. It's kind of something you'd find more in idyllic communities and rural reclusiveness, think cults and all that kind of vibe, and it's right up my alley. One that a vast majority of you are already probably familiar with is dark fantasy, which refers to fantasy worlds where grim themes, nihilistic plots, or horrifying elements inform the fantasy tale that you're playing out. Curse of Strahd is a decent example of this, but you probably need to turn the notches up a little bit to make it that much more horrifying. There's psychological horror, which is entirely focused around the perception of what is true and what defines reality. Kind of Inception, but even more scary. There's several more genres and subgenres of horror that you can run and implement, but they're the ones that I typically encounter the most and find the most enjoyable. The world is genuinely your dark and decrepit oyster, but with any of these options, which should really go without saying, you need to make sure that your players are comfortable with playing within that setting. So let's talk about safety tools. Okay, now just shut up for a second. Before you go and crack the sads, if you're getting triggered about the idea of getting your players' consent and approval to participate in anything, irrespective on whether or not that's horror or graphic themes, you're probably not a very nice person to be around. So just reassess that for a second, and we'll continue. Horror can very easily tread into some dark and uncomfortable areas that may or may not impact your playgroup, so it's pivotal to check in with them. As the GM, our goal is to immerse players, not accidentally cause distress. So, let's not do that. It's really simple and easy to keep horror fun and effective for everyone. And the easiest starting point for all of this is effective lines and veils. Before even sitting down with your players, ask them if there are any themes or topics they prefer not to encounter in the game. Some people might not be comfortable with body horror or mental manipulation. Establishing lines, which are your hard limits, and veils, which are topics to fade to black on, helps you shape the game's horror within everyone's comfort zone. From here, running a session 0 dedicated to discussing themes and player comfort can really help further set these boundaries. I know this sounds like I'm really beating a dead horse here, but it's so simple and really effortless to organize these sessions with your players, so why would you not? One of the important differences with safety tools specifically when running any kind of horror is that it's kind of setting an expectation and limit of how far you can actually go. Throughout these conversations, you'll actually uncover an arsenal of green lights that your players are willing to be scared about, I guess is the best way of informing it. So you're actually uncovering an arsenal of things you can throw at your players that you may not have known if you could do before. Having tools in place like the X card method is a straightforward way to pause the game if anyone feels too uncomfortable. If someone simply taps or raises the X card, they don't have to explain. You'll just skip or adjust the scene accordingly, allowing everyone to feel secure in the scariest setting that you're running. There's a wealth of incredible resources online to help you effectively implement safety tools into your campaigns. Like Ginny D has an incredible in-depth video that covers off everything better than I ever could, so I'll add links to those in my description. I don't know why I chose to film this on a 26-degree day, but it is getting very sweaty in here. Once your players have established that they are happy to participate, it's time to get them to fully buy into the spookier nature that you might be trying to set. Just as a PSA, you're going to learn very quickly throughout the rest of this video that I have a very small vocabulary when it comes to synonyms for horror, so spooky it is. Player buy-in for good horror is essential because without it, all of your work on immersion and tension can unravel way too quickly. So the question we're trying to answer is, how do we get players to lean into this fear factor? And the answer is a lot simpler than you may be thinking. Before you even start the campaign, and something that you should have addressed in your session zeros and lines and veils with your players, is discussing your goals of horror in the session or campaign that you're trying to run. Ask your players to approach the game with a mindset that their characters can and will feel fear. I mean, you can even ask them during the session zeros what their character's deepest fear is, and this could be a fun, twisted callback later on to use for your own cruel and unusual punishments to that player. I love being a DM. If they go into it thinking nothing's going to scare me, it really undermines the entire atmosphere that you're trying to create. Also, make sure to remind your players that horror works best when everyone's leaning into it. Now, don't get me wrong, a little humor here and there is natural, but too much of it can break immersion. It's really important to get everyone on the same page beforehand so that during the session, all those horror beats that you're trying to hit just land that little bit harder. I've just had a complete mental side tangent, and I really want to try and run a horror campaign in the new 2024 D&D rules. I think that'd be really fun, but not everyone has access to that, so how would I do that effectively?
Hey dude, have you been up all night? Who has time to sleep? I'm trying to memorize all of the 2024 rule changes. Okay, but why? Well, this is going to be my first time running a game in the new rule set, and none of you have access to the PHB. Someone has to know it all. You do know that it's all on Roll20 now, right? What? Yeah, and as a matter of fact, you can view all the basic changes for free and make as many 2024 characters as you want. Aw, son of a bitch!
If you haven't already picked up on it, this video is sponsored by Roll20. Roll20 now is the 2024 Player's Handbook available to use right now for new games or pre-existing 2014 ones, as both are completely compatible with one another. Just to touch on some of the overall improvements Roll20 have simultaneously rolled out to improve this massive release, we've got the following new features. The compact view is now the default format of viewing your character sheet, and in my opinion is a much more aesthetically digestible format that is much easier for newer players to navigate and adapt to. For more experienced Roll20 users, some of the more nitpicky issues have been completely rectified with inclusions like proficiency toggles, feature tracking, condition tracking, drag and drop weapon mastery, and tooltips. Yes, to tooltips. I can't remember never having them before now that I've got them. On top of this as well, the entire compendium got a massive overhaul, all for the better. It's just chef's kiss. You can't see me, but I did the thing. One thing that also needs a massive call out is their brand new, incredibly visual character builder that simplifies the entire character creation process beyond belief, which I still feel is one of the most intimidating parts of introducing new players into the world of D&D. Just look how visually aesthetic and easy this is. Of course, because this specifically is so new, there's going to be some continuous improvements rolled out over the coming months, so look out for them. And again, thank you to Roll20 for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get into the best bits. Cue spooky tunes. I'm a big vibe guy, and there's few things you'll find that are as effective for vibes as good soundscaping. Sounds and music are your best friends in a horror game because they set the scene that words alone don't quite do justice to. I personally opt for eerie ambient sounds rather than full tracks because things like wind howling, creaking wood, distant footsteps and things of this nature can trigger unease subconsciously in your players, which is exactly what I want to do. Sometimes no sound at all is actually the scariest option. Letting players feel the quiet between scenes or encounters builds suspense, and a silent pause after a terrifying description can let that fear sink in even more effectively. There's so many tools available out there like tabletop audio, Sirenscape, Pocket Bard, or even just YouTube playlists that can bring these sounds to life, and then all you need is a description of the scenario to match. So imagine, if you will, a town square. It sprawls wide before you, eerily silent under a sky thick with unmoving clouds. The cobblestones are slick with moisture, though there hasn't been a drop of rain. Every window in the surrounding buildings is dark, with some shutters hanging crooked, like watchful eyes half-lidded in wary expectation. The only sound is the faint rustle of the wind as it drags scrapes of faded paper and brittle leaves in a slow, looping circle through the square, almost as if something invisible is pacing. A dried fountain stands in the center, its stone figures of townsfolk cracked and crumbling, each face etched with a frozen expression that makes it feel too lifelike, as if they're caught mid-scream or in a desperate prayer. Beneath your feet, Faint scorch marks and scattered bits of broken glass hint at something violent that once marred this place. Occasionally, you catch a feeling of being watched, but every corner remains stubbornly empty, just shadows pulling unnaturally deep and still. Look, I'm a little bit proud of that one, but hopefully you felt the same je ne sais quoi that I was going for. It's so effective to just get some eerie, suspenseful music and read fancy words that you had to look up on Wikipedia because your vocabulary is the equivalent of a 9-year-old. I love horror. Now let's assess where we're at so far. We've got a setting and our players have bought into this setting. We've got safety tools established. We've got really effective sound design. There's only one more piece to the puzzle that's missing, and that piece is tension. And what ruins tension in almost every single conceivable outlet of horror? Plot armor. So, we don't use it. Not just specifically for horror settings, but plot armor as a whole in TTRPGs is often the bane of most campaigns. Why should a player ever actually care about the world that they're playing within? They know that their character won't actually die or suffer real consequences. To keep tension alive and at its highest, you need to adjust how you handle plot armor in your game. And the simplest answer is always the most effective. Introduce real stakes. Players might be cautious, but knowing that their characters aren't actually invincible will make their decisions feel much more significant. Emphasize that while you aren't aiming to end anyone's story prematurely, a horror game may involve physical or mental consequences that can't just be shrugged off, like lingering mental or physical effects, and if they've agreed to it, character death. Think about ways to show consequences, like diminishing a character's mental resilience or sense of safety. Maybe they start seeing things that other players can't. Or instead, maybe in combat encounters, it's not clear to them who the actual enemies are that are around them. If players believe their character's mind can be affected, they'll approach threats with more caution, making the game scarier. And then you can effectively implement and splice in the more tension-raising elements, like sending someone a written description or audio file with some terrifying details or sounds that isn't sent to anyone else. Get creative with it, scare them, make it spooky. See, my vocabulary is not very diverse. I really think that's enough of me for now, but I'll end on this. Horror can be one of the most memorable experiences in TTRPGs, but it takes careful preparation, clear communication, and trust to work effectively. With buy-in from players, a well-crafted soundscape, real stakes, and respect for everyone's limits, your horror game can be as terrifying as it is thrilling. Let your players face their fears, but remember, it's the connection you build together that makes the horror really hit home. I've never known how to end videos, so happy Halloween.